So Nassau developed, and much of this is taken from Dr. Saunders' Loyalists. Nassau developed into a thriving seaport, and the increased trade, the flurry of privateering opportunities, and the 1,400-strong force of wreckers contributed to the prosperity of the times. Marine occupations provided a livelihood for many free blacks, persons of color, and slaves who became expert pilots, navigators, and commanders. William Wiley, a Loyalist planter and Attorney General of the Bahamas, wrote in 1815, "Our black seamen are perhaps equal to any in the world. Our island vessels are principally manned by them, and many of our drogas, turtlers, and fishing vessels are commanded by them. These black crewmen and commanders received a percentage of the profits from each cruise or voyage they took. This doubtless amounted to a substantial sum at times." This is from Whittington Johnson. So in one respect, life for the old inhabitants, especially on New Providence in the northern islands, was much unchanged after the introduction of the cotton plantations. However, the town of Nassau changed considerably as the Loyalist merchants and professionals slowly gained control of the government and built public buildings in the town, displacing the earlier residents over time. Residential living became segregated so that poor whites lived to the east and west of the town. Rich whites, mostly Loyalists, lived on the northern ridge with their domestics at the southern boundary of the estate. And 3 areas to the south of the town were set aside for the blacks. These new black settlements, in addition to the increase of plantations to the east and west of New Providence, provided communities where Creole systems could crystallize uninfluenced by colonial English dialects, and decreased the opportunities for slaves or African speakers to acquire a dialect of English, as was the case in the Kong period. So, I mean, constant change of the landscape, of the linguistic landscape, because of the different migrations, as well as the changing social conditions, particularly in New Providence. The language situation on New Providence is interesting, since the slave population was 1/3 old Bahamian slaves, so Gold Coast ancestry, 1/3 Loyalist slaves, so Congo and Senegambian ancestry, and 1/3 new Africans, this latest migration from the Bight of Biafra, Igbo, Senegambia, Fulla, and West Central Africa, Congo. Most likely the new Africans worked on the plantations in the outlying areas of New Providence, and the Creole speakers would be employed in the homes and on the vessels. As the slave population grew, there would be an increasing number of Creole speakers who spoke a distinctive Bahamian Creole as a result of the linguistic influences from the different language migrations to New Providence. This system would be different to the more Gullah-influenced variation of BCE on the islands. Or, I mean, yeah, the more Gullah influence, but Gullah and the merge of the languages spoken by the second group of migrators. I want to look at my last period now, the liberated Africans. At a time when many of the British plantation colonies saw a decrease in the number of Africans in their population, the Bahamas' African population was increasing with the introduction of over 6,000 Africans from 1811 to 1860. I couldn't get these all on one slide, so I have a second slide, but I'll just hold it at that for a minute. And the interesting thing, of course, about this data is that we can see what ethnic groups they're from. We can see what ports in Africa they have come from. So this provides obviously excellent insight into what might take place as far as the emerging Creole English is concerned. So these new arrivals disembarked from ports in Africa as human cargo on Portuguese slave ships, which were intercepted by the British Navy to uphold the abolition of slavery laws. They were then taken to ports where mixed commissions in Vice Admiralty courts adjudicated and granted their freedom. It is actually amazing. I mean, the first 6 on this list, I had to take some of this detail out, but the first 6 are well documented. And there is a lot of information we can learn about them in terms of whether they were married, what age they were, what names they were given, but I just couldn't include everything in it. But I mean, the important thing is not the 6,000 arriving over this great expanse of time, but between 1831 and 1841, the country received close to 5,000 recaptives. Now, 5,000 new people is a significant number for a population of 16,000, approximately 10,000 of whom were of African ancestry and 6,000 of European, more African influence. This group of new Africans had a resounding impact on the culture and language as they increased the African speakers to 27% of the black population. They more than doubled the free black population, thereby making the whites a minority of free people. The imperial policy for settling these liberated Africans was to offer them indentureships, or to recruit them, I have a shot here, or to recruit them in the West Indian Regiment or the Navy. The collector of customs was in charge of their settlement, and it's interesting that the collector in 1831 was described as having a profound knowledge in the Mandingo, Igbo, and Coromantine slangs. That's from Howard Johnson. The majority of liberated Africans served out their indentures, working alongside slaves, and like slaves were employed as fishermen, wreckers, woodcutters, salt rakers, and also in agriculture and domestic labor in New Providence and the Out Islands. Also, despite some initial tensions between the Bahamian slaves and the new Africans, evidence suggests that this antagonism was not sustained since they eventually married or cohabited with slaves or former slaves. The predominance of men and children among the liberated Africans was a demographic that of necessity promoted intercourse with others outside their group. All right, I wanna, this is a little bit about the psychology of the liberated Africans, that their free status allowed them a consciousness of themselves as a community and gave them an agency in their life affairs such that their African heritage was cause for celebration and not shame, in contrast to that of the slaves. The designation of African villages throughout New Providence and the identification of certain out islands for their settlement. I'm going to go to the out islands, I'll go back to the villages. Facilitated retention of their African culture, including their language. Indeed, government's prohibition against outside intrusion into the designated African villages created exclusive African domains which acted like incubators for those things African. In addition, the popular friendly societies such as the Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, and Congo societies, as well as the Baptist and Wesley chapels, the latter originally established for specific and exclusive use of free African immigrants, were community centers where the liberated Africans gathered on a regular basis to celebrate their collective African identities and to promote a sense of African solidarity. The Baptist magazine of 1860 has some wonderful accounts of the things that took place at Wesley Chapel and the Baptist Church. So I'm quoting in 1860 from a meeting where it is said all the speeches except one were by native Africans. We have a nation of copies of texts, and 3 brethren had copies from them. This greatly interested the Africans who were present, and if you had been among us, you would have rejoiced at the hearty pleasure that their country people had the scripture in their own language, unquote. That's from the Baptist magazine. And much later in the century, New England visitors Dickinson and Dowd write of their experience in New Providence. Quote, "There are many native Africans here who distinctively remember the land of their birth, their own language for the most part, and understand us but little better than we understand them. Nangos, Congos, Congars, or Nangobars, the almanac calls them, but Nango and Egba are the only ones we have found," unquote.